Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new talk in the Paideia Institute public lecture series. Today, we have the pleasure to host a lecture by my longtime friend and colleague, Stuart McManus. Stuart is a Latinist and a scholar of the classical tradition in global and multi-ethnic contexts, with a particular focus on the reception of ancient Mediterranean culture in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, as well as among people of color in the United States. Stuart holds a PhD in history and classical philology from Harvard University, which is where we first met, and is now assistant professor of pre-modern world history at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Stuart is a very prolific writer. He's published over 30 articles, reviews, and book chapters on topics ranging from Roman law and the history of slavery to indigenous language philology and contemporary Latinx culture. He also has a piece on Cicero's Brutus in our own Festschrift for Reginald Foster, which was published by the Paideia Press in 2018. His research work, as you can see, is very diversified and multifaceted, but we can say that it's all part of a larger intellectual project to uncover the complex role played by Greco-Roman antiquity in non-Western cultures, and to engage students who have traditionally been underrepresented in the field. His latest book came out with Cambridge University Press in 2021 and is entitled Empire of Eloquence, the Classical Rhetorical Tradition in Colonial Latin America and the Iberian World. The book explores the global history of Renaissance humanism based on primary research in 13 countries across Latin America, Europe, and Asia. In fact, I still recall with fondness the various times when Stuart and I met at the Harvard Faculty Club in the short intervals between his various trips to Latin America, East Asia, and so on. He's now working on a second book on the global history of the famous or infamous 1619 slave journey to Virginia. Without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Stuart for his lecture. Please join me in welcoming Stuart McManus.
So thank you, Jason, and thank you, Marco. If you can hear me, let's make a start, shall we? So, in the years following 1500 of the Common Era, Rome was reborn on a global scale. From the Philippines in the east to California in the west, the composite kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, at times under a single crown, at others as separate kingdoms, built entangled global monarchies that contemporaries described as nothing less than a new Roman Empire. Indeed, like Rome, Iberia's global empires were born in an explosion of violence that scarred not only the Western Mediterranean, which they too came to control, but also large parts of the Americas, coastal Africa, and maritime Asia. This was an expansionist, hierarchical slave society that consciously and unconsciously followed in the footsteps of its ancient predecessor, as it variously allied with, conquered, and to a greater or lesser extent integrated Aztecs, Incas, South Asians, Filipinos, the Chinese of coastal Guangdong, and Africans, both enslaved and free. To borrow the words that the Roman historian Tacitus famously puts into the mouth of an ancient Caledonian, staring death at the hands of Roman legionaries in the face, neither the East nor the West satisfies them. They make a desert and call it peace. As in antiquity, Iberian, or to use the terminology of many at the time, Hispanic colonialism, was also not limited to territorial conquest. Rather, it brought with it an early modern incarnation of Roman law, a Roman imperial political language, and Roman concepts of slavery and citizenship. Ancient languages and texts, too, followed in its wake, aided by the Catholic religious orders, who founded institutions to teach what they called the Studia Humanitatis, a revived Christianized Paideia, grounded in Latin and Greek grammar, rhetoric, logic, moral philosophy, history, and poetics. Humanist schools and universities were built for male Iberians or mestizos, or people of mixed descent who passed as Iberians, and elite indigenous people in Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. The most famous example being the college at Tlatelolco in Mexico City, which, as you might just be able to make out on the screen, was built on the ruins of an Aztec temple. That's the temple, the ruins of the temple in the front of the image there. In these separate but equal colleges, equality was, of course, an illusion, although they did produce numerous native Latinists, including Bartolomé Saguinsin, who, as you'll be able to see on the screen, identified as an Indus Tagalus, an indigenous Tagalog-speaking Filipino. While similar, the situation was also somewhat different in continental Asia. For instance, Jesuit schools in Portuguese India quickly came to be dominated not by Iberians, but by Brahmins, that is to say, high caste South Asians. Similarly, in southern Japan, an area not territorially part of any Iberian empire, but an integral part of Iberian trade networks, colleges were set up exclusively for ethnically Japanese students. There, in Nagasaki, students ate a Buddhist vegetarian diet and dressed in blue kimonos as they studied both Western classics and Sino-Japanese humanities. It is this relationship between what today we would call race and ethnicity, but what contemporaries called Casta, and the classical tradition, class, gender, colonialism, that are the subject of my talk today. In particular, I'm going to focus on the ways ancient literary forms and civic practices gave indigenous Asian, African, and Iberian students of antiquity ways to carve out a place for themselves within this hierarchical global space. Neo-Roman imperialism, as we shall see, occasioned neo-Roman responses and acts of negotiation that found expression within the context of contemporary constructions of casta and gender, as well as long-standing, often pre-colonial class structures. These are issues that I'll address in 3 historical episodes, which will chart the little-known global reception of the classical tradition in the early modern Hispanic world, focusing in turn on race, gender, class, while highlighting that these categories were not always as rigid and determinative as the textbooks might lead us to believe. In these episodes, I'm going to draw on my recent book that Marco mentioned, which is a reception history of classical rhetoric in the Spanish and Portuguese empires, as well as a new project on the global reception of Roman slave law. It also draws on my ongoing research on Native American and African Latin authors. This is all work that has been made possible by an extended period of research in archives and libraries in 13 countries, mapped here on the screen, where I examined hundreds of unstudied Latin texts, many of which have remained in manuscript and undisturbed since the 16th century. Before proceeding, however, it's important to understand exactly how race and ethnicity, or to use the historically correct category, casta, worked in the early modern Hispanic world. The word casta, of course, comes ultimately from the Latin word castus, meaning variously pure, spotless, or guiltless. And its use to refer to inherited traits is first in the vernacular, is first attested in the 15th century during the Christian Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, where it denoted the difference between those of pure Christian descent and those who had Jewish or Muslim ancestry. In the age of European colonialism, what had been an ethno-religious framework was then repurposed to refer to the non-Christian populations of the Americas and elsewhere, whose position as, quote, new Christians meant that they lacked so-called blood.
Sorry, hang on one second. Sorry about that, Stuart. I'll mute her. Hang on.
Desde las víctimas del conflicto armado, desde la forma y la narración en que ellos consideran que la satisfacción como parte integral de la reparación de las víctimas como.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's okay. So in the age of European colonialism, what had been an ethno-religious framework was repurposed to refer to the non-Christian populations of the Americas and elsewhere, whose position as, quote, new Christians meant that they lacked what was called at the time blood purity, or limpieza de sangre. It was in this context that Casta took on a form that would pave the way for later conceptions of race, as a universalizing, if not quite fully global discourse that categorized humanity according to perceived physical and biomoral traits that were considered hereditary. In this Casta system, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were broadly speaking subordinated to Europeans, while Black Africans occupied the lowest rung of the ladder, the justification being that as non-Christian inhabitants of the Old World, they had had access to, but had ignored the message of the gospel, an argument that was frequently found alongside references to the curse of Ham and the growing association between Blackness and slavery. The flip side of this was, however, that there was a space, a vanishingly small but real space, for those who could claim Ethiopian descent to assert their status as old Christians, since Ethiopia had been converted in late antiquity. At the same time, some groups in Asia, including the Chinese and Japanese, enjoyed a special status, being frequently seen as virtuous pagans, a position shared to a somewhat lesser extent by high caste South Asians. The word caste here, incidentally, being a 16th century English borrowing from the Portuguese word casta. All these constructions, of course, intersected with class structures. For instance, an illustrious Aztec or Inca lineage brought with it significant privilege. And similar ideas existed for Asians, although not normally Africans, with some rare exceptions, such as the three gentlemen from Esmeraldas, who headed the so-called República de Zambos in northern Ecuador. And these are the three men you see on the slide. Within such a society, then, it's no wonder that mixing was both a topic of fear and fascination, as we might infer from the famous Casta paintings of colonial Mexico. Gender too mattered. Women were not generally permitted to attend grammar schools and universities, with the result that classical learning became a defining feature of elite masculinity in the Hispanic world. This said, some women did gain access to Greek and Latin texts in the original or translation. The most famous Hispanic example being the Mexican nun, poet, and mystic, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, pictured here on the screen. Not only did Sor Juana read Aristotle, whose name you might just be able to make out on the spine of the book behind her quill pen, but she also wrote poetry, filled with classical illusions. Casta, class, and gender. These then are the intersecting factors that combined to shape access to and the application of the classical tradition, and which we will keep in mind as we turn now to our first episode. So like the freed slaves of ancient Rome, who left monuments like the one you see on the screen, Juan Latino, a free Black African who lived in Granada in southern Spain during the 16th century, was determined that posterity remember that while born a slave, he died free and a figure of some distinction. This we learn from a sepulchral monument that once graced this church in Granada. Although it was destroyed by a fire in the 19th century, thanks to early modern and antiquarians of the sort made famous by Tony Grafton, Juan Latino's Latin epitaph, which he composed himself, has survived. And this is number 1 on the handout, if you happen to have it to hand. Scholar of Granada and teacher of noble young students, orator singularly pious in learning and life, offspring and dark-skinned son of Ethiopian forebears. He learned as an innocent child the precepts that lead to salvation, and sang in the Latin tongue the deeds of the august Austrian. Here he means John of Austria, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Under this tombstone he lies. He will rise with his faithful wife. Juan Latino, you see, had been born into slavery in 1520 in the household of the Spanish Duke of Casta. He was thus subject to what we might call the dark side of the Greco-Roman inheritance, the Hispanic world's neo-Roman slavery, which was heavily influenced, just as Islamic slavery was, by Roman law. Here, it's important to remember that in contrast to many pre-modern societies, which recognize sliding scales of bondage, indebtedness, and dependency, the Romans made a relatively binary distinction between the free and the enslaved. As the Roman jurist Gaius, whose words preserved in the digest, and this is number 2 on the handout, put it, therefore, the fundamental division in the law of persons is that all men and women are either free or are slaves. With the increasing need for labor at any cost in the Americas, Iberians turned to the slave markets of West Africa, justifying their complicity in what quickly became a binary racialized form of slavery, with the idea that the enslaved had been captured in so-called just wars and therefore forfeited their freedom. How or where Latino's mother was enslaved, we don't know. What we do know is that his life would not follow the pattern of many of the enslaved Africans in the Hispanic world. As a child, he was assigned to serve his master's young son, and as one contemporary tells us, quote, against the will of those who controlled the age of minority of the Duke, he would accompany his master to his lessons any time he could defy their vigilance. These secret studies of Latin and Greek meant that when he accompanied his master to the University of Granada in 1533, he was able to benefit vicariously from the educational environment, soon surpassing the Duke, while at least officially remaining his property. A few years later, the Duke left Granada to join the court of Charles V, and before leaving, he freed or emancipated Latino. While we know very little about the circumstances of Latino's manumission, we get a sense of how it might have worked from Gomes Vass's contemporary Latin treatise written in Portuguese India, which treats the manumission of African, South Asian, and even Japanese slaves, and which, since it remains in manuscript, I hope one day to edit and translate. As in Rome, freed slaves could become citizens, with citizenship understood as the rights and privileges associated with Hispanic vecindad, or residence in the master's city, in this case, Granada. Having gained his freedom and become a vecino, roughly a citizen, Latino became a teacher of Latin and Greek. Not unlike the 18th century Jamaican Latin teacher Francis Williams, who, as you can see from the painting, also owned a large collection of books and scientific instruments. As a free person of color like Williams, Juan Latino also faced considerable obstacles in the world of Hispanic letters. Indeed, the derisive reference to Latino we find in Golden Age, derisive references to Latino we find in Golden Age literature give us some sense of his situation. For instance, Cervantes mocked him in what are called broken end verses in the prologue to Don Quixote, which is number 3 on the handout. While a later play entitled simply Juan Latino by Diego Jimenez de Enciso concentrated not on Latino's skills at versification, but on the Black hypersexuality which Hispanic society frequently attributed to Africans. However, as a Latin humanist living in a neo-Roman empire, there were some uniquely classical ways for him to push back and defy the oppressive Casta system, 3 of which are worth highlighting. First, he used classical learning to claim a high position in the class hierarchy. This, remember, was a world where true nobility was imagined to be a function of virtue, and classical learning, with its store of virtuous examples, was the best path to nobility for men of humble birth and without military experience, as the myriad of contemporary Latin treatises on the topic attest, and Latino's epitaph proudly proclaims. Second, he used his skills in Latin to attract noble patrons. This was because in the Hispanic world, there was considerable prestige attached to having an entourage of scholar poets, to being a Maecenas with a train of Horaces and Virgils. In Latino's case, he sought and gained the patronage of the president of the royal court in Andalusia, Pedro de Deza. Deza, in turn, invited Latino to paint him in a favorable light by composing Latin verses to celebrate the victory of Spain and its allies over the Ottomans in the naval battle at Lepanto in 1571, which Latino dedicated jointly to his patron and the king. This took the form of an epillion in 1800 hexameter verses entitled Austrias Carmen, which recounts the deeds of John of Austria, who commanded the Christian navy. In it, Latino compares Lepanto to Octavian's victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at nearby Actium in 31 BCE, and constantly imitates Virgil, a few examples of which you'll find as number 4 on the handout. To turn to the third and final of Latino's neo-Roman strategies. In his poetry, Latino constantly stresses his connection, not to a generalized Africa, but to Ethiopia. This gave him both a Christian lineage, and thereby limpieza di sangre, and a foothold in the ancient Mediterranean, since ancient texts frequently refer in a curious but not necessarily denigrating way to Black Africans, who are described using the ethnic moniker Ethiopian. By referring to himself as an Ethiopian, including in the opening of a poem written in the same year to celebrate the birth of an heir to the Spanish monarchy. This is number 5 on the handout. He was claiming a place for himself in contemporary society on the basis of an ancient precedent. All this culminated in a powerful attack on prejudice in his work dedicated to the king's newborn son, with which I will close this episode. This is number 6 on the handout. If my black face, O king, displeases your courtiers, a white face does not please the men of Ethiopia. There, a white man who visits the East is despised, and there are black leaders, and there is even a dark-skinned king. He concludes, let generations of rulers, let the Roman Empire rightly envy, O Philip, your black bard. Now, slavery was not the only neo-Roman institution in the Hispanic world that produced gendered and class-conscious neo-Roman responses, as we shall see in the second episode, which treats the ways ancient examples were used to construct a vision of elite masculinity that was used to model colonial interactions, giving those who wielded it significant agency. So in 1665, Philip IV, King of Spain and Emperor of the Indies, died in Madrid. And before long, his whole empire knew. The news quickly traversed the Mediterranean, traveled across Europe, and was carried across the Atlantic and the Pacific, arriving in the Philippines almost 2 years later. Soon after, in Lima and Manila, and Oran in North Africa. In short, in all the cities you see marked here on the map, masses were sung, neo-Roman ephemeral architecture built, Latin verses written, and funeral orations delivered, either in Latin or the vernacular. To take the particularly well-documented case of Mexico City, a funeral cortege processed to the city's cathedral, where they were greeted by the newly constructed monument you see on the screen, known in Spanish as a túmulo, from the Latin tumulus, or funeral mound. This was modeled on ancient funeral pyres that Renaissance antiquarians had reconstructed on the basis of classical texts and material culture, such as the Roman coin you see on the screen. Sitting in order of rank, the exclusively male audience gazed up at the monumental structure, towering some 84 feet above them. This was formed of 3 levels, supported by Corinthian columns. On the first level stood statues of heroic men from antiquity, like Alexander the Great, Theseus, and Jason, which were in turn flanked by statues of 4 women representing the 4 ancient names of Spain. These statues framed a copy of Philip's crown and sat beneath a labarum, the military banner of the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, featuring the first 2 letters of the Greek word for Christ, Chi-Rho. The second level featured a statue of Philip surrounded by 4 statues of the biblical Solomon. And looking down on them all, from the third level, stood the figure of Fides, or faith. The túmulo also featured over 1,000 candles, whose rising smoke, contemporaries thought, mirrored the ascension of Philip's soul in this moment of imperial apotheosis. This was a visual extravaganza, legible to the lettered and unlettered alike, that remade Philip into a virtuous and pious Roman emperor, and, as we shall see, made the same simultaneously loyalist but self-empowering gendered argument as the funeral oration that would soon resound through the cathedral. Indeed, this connection between art and oratory was explicitly made at the time by Sor Juana, the erudite Mexican nun, who wrote this about a roughly contemporary piece of ephemeral architecture. And this is number 7 on the handout. This tongueless Cicero, this mute Demosthenes, who with elegant words tells us of your triumphs. Perhaps gesturing at the tumulo, the orator on this occasion, Nicolas del Puerto, who was of mixed Spanish and noble indigenous descent, proceeded to echo his fellow orators in every corner of Philip's global empire by delivering a textbook example of epidictic oratory, that is to say, a speech that dealt with praise and blame. As such, it was structured around the deceased's external circumstances, physical attributes, and virtues, as set out in Book 3 of the Rhetorica ad Herennium. It also made frequent reference to exemplary figures from antiquity, including Alexander and the emperors Trajan and Theodosius, since while virtues in the abstract were usually gendered as feminine, particular examples of them were usually masculine. Like any good student of classical rhetoric, Del Puerto also imitated the best models. Of course, little in the way of ancient Latin funeral oratory had survived, so he had to look to alternative sources. Of these, Pliny, the younger Pliny's panegyric for Trajan was of particular use, alongside the funeral oratory of the Church Fathers, especially Ambrose's funeral orations for the emperors Theodosius and Valentinian II. As a result of these highly heterogeneous models, Del Puerto's style was eclectic, although overall rather silvery or Senecan. Moving through Philip's virtues according to the precepts of epidictic oratory, Del Puerto painted him as an ancient alpha male, more clement than Constantine, more generous than Alexander, more pious than the previous 3 Philips combined, an argument that mirrored the message of the funeral pyre. Yet this was not just a supporter of an absolutist monarchy, beating his listeners into submission with eloquence and erudition. Rather, Del Puerto produced a gendered neo-Roman celebration of a classicizing economy of virtue that mirrored ancient strategies for negotiating with power. So how did this, quote, economy of virtue work? In the first place, we have to remember that these funeral orations reflected Aristotle's observation in the Rhetoric, and this is number 8 on the handout, that the line between the praise of virtue and an exhortation to virtue was very thin. Just as Pliny had used his panegyric to encourage Trajan and his successors to follow in the emperor's footsteps, Del Puerto did not intend necessarily to glorify the king or even accurately represent him. Instead, he aimed to encourage others, including the colonial officials in the audience, to emulate an idealized Philip in his cultivation of widely accepted norms of behavior. Subjects naturally rallied around these ideas, not for the greater glory of the empire, but to further their own interests. Who among such an audience would not applaud exhortations to justice, clemency, and liberality that could be used to hold in check rapacious colonial officials and grasping settler colonizers? In a culture where morality and legality were essentially one and the same, and the king was the highest magistrate, the rigorous policing of virtue and the sense that the monarch was virtuous gave subjects some reassurance that their rights and privileges would be protected in this age before liberalism. At the same time, it also gave them a language to negotiate with power. This they did in the thousands upon thousands of surviving legal petitions that made constant appeals to the language of virtue, both to praise and to blame, as you can see in number 9 on the handout. This was a way to carve out a place for themselves in an imperial system that veered back and forth between petition and response and command and obey, to borrow the words of the Roman historian Fergus Miller. Significantly, this was a vision of politics embedded in a vision of masculinity that could also be applied, mutatis mutandis, in funeral orations for important women, as we learn from this example for the Vicereine of Mexico, delivered in the cathedral in Mexico City in 1619. Since he was presenting the Viceroy's wife as a model for imitation to an exclusively male audience, the orator on this occasion made it clear both that she possessed virtues beyond those of most women, and that the particular virtues that she exemplified, including piety, fortitude, temperance, modesty, and civic mindedness, were desirable in both men and women. The Vicereine's life was thus a feminine exemplar of masculine virtue that contributed to this larger virtue-driven and gendered neo-Roman political culture. Such neo-Roman strategies of social ordering and negotiation also crossed the boundaries of casta, as becomes clear when we read the funeral oration delivered in this rather beautiful church in what was the semi-autonomous indigenous Republic of Tlaxcala, now the smallest state in the Mexican Republic. This entirely unstudied oration is unique for a number of reasons. First, it was heard by an audience that identified as indigenous, not Iberian. Second, it was delivered in front of a funeral pyre that featured representations of pre-Columbian nobles, which perhaps resembled this 19th century neoclassical statue of the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtemoc, now on one of the main boulevards of Mexico City. Third, it included a long comparison between the city-state of Tlaxcala and another republic, Rome, with which it shared a mixed constitution, a fact that inspired a later Mexican artist to paint this classicizing image of the Tlaxcalan Senate. This said, it was in many ways also a typical epidactic oration. As the Tlaxcalans listened, the orators reminded them that, and I quote, and this is number 10 on the handout, Philip shaped his kingdom more by his example than by the exercise of his power, since a monarch should be, quote, a mirror for the republic. Although the use of a non-indigenous rhetorical form entailed a loss of cultural autonomy, the Tlaxcalans were also pragmatically aware that an idealized vision of Philip's life, couched in this ancient Mediterranean, not Mesoamerican form, could serve as a model for those in power, who could then be held to account for their actions according to this standard. At the same time, the importation of an originally Mediterranean cultural form did not represent a complete break from pre-Hispanic practices. We know, for instance, that the nearby Mexica, better known as the Aztecs, had cultivated virtue-driven eloquence and erudition in what they called huehuetlatoli, or ancestral speech, which was taught at priestly schools called Calmecac, like the one you see on the screen. Epideictic rhetoric and humanist schools were perhaps then just as much signs of continuity as change from an indigenous perspective. To conclude this second episode then, these celebrations of a classicizing image of masculine behavior were means for colonial subjects, both Iberian and indigenous, to exert agency. By reminding themselves and those in power of Alexander and Constantine, they both asserted their identities as elite males and created a space for themselves to act in this hierarchical global sphere. Now, of course, Iberian expansion and the parallel spread of Roman Catholicism affected societies across the globe that were already highly socially stratified. It is class and related categories then that are the focus of this final episode. So one Sunday in the mid-17th century, the Jesuit missionary Miguel de Almeida mounted the gilded pulpit of the Church of John the Baptist at Benaulim in Portuguese India to address his congregation of native Indian Christians in the local language of Konkani. The occasion was the Catholic feast day commemorating the imprisonment and decapitation or decollation of John the Baptist, a figure well known to Indian Catholics, and whom you see represented in this Indo-Portuguese ivory carving. On this occasion, Almeida began, perhaps surprisingly, and this is number 11 on your handout, Seneca speaks in praise of the constancy, or satvadiru, of Socrates, noting the great courage of this unfortunate sage. For instance, Socrates withstood being thrown into prison because of evil and envy on the part of his enemy. Yet thanks to his constancy and courage, he could not be troubled, nor his sensations descend into the realm of pain in that place, and he happily entered into prison. Almeida then quoted a passage in Latin from a work by the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca, which describes Socrates not being at all distressed at the prospect of an ignominious death, but stoically accepting his fate. This he translated into Konkani before continuing. If Seneca says that Socrates showed his wisdom by acting in this way, then we today, for this very same reason, should show great honor to John the Baptist. In the classical rhetorical tradition, a comparatio or comparison with an ancient precedent was by far and away the most popular type of opening for an oration, sacred or secular. And this is exactly what we have here. This indeed was the same strategy employed by the Japanese seminarian Juan Latino in his Latin oration delivered a few decades earlier in the nearby Jesuit college at Goa, in which he urged his listeners to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great in an epideictic oration, ornamented several times with that most famous of Ciceronian clausulas, esse videatur. And I've just put a reference to this speech as number 12 on the handout. Like Hera's invocation of the young king of Macedon, Almeida's account of Socrates' imprisonment was not a classicizing aberration. Indeed, structurally, Almeida's sermon followed the conventions of epideictic oratory exactly. There were also references to exemplary figures, something we find in Almeida's other sermons, which refer to Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and even at one point to Antony and Cleopatra. This epideictic sermon was, you see, a product of a syncretic culture of what I call Indo-humanism that united local linguistic, rhetorical, and philosophical traditions with the textual inheritance of the ancient Mediterranean. The development of this Indo-humanism may have had its origins partly in the realization on the part of missionaries that the Indo-European languages of the region had close affinities to Latin and Greek. Indeed, although he didn't understand the underlying relationship between the languages of Europe and Northern India, another Jesuit missionary at the time, called Ignazio Arcamone, went as far as to use Latin as a pedagogical seedbed in which to plant an Indian language such as Konkani. As he noted in his manuscript grammar, and you can see this on the screen, Konkani syntax hardly differs from that of Latin, but for a few additions. Missionaries could, at least in the first instance, he implied, think in Latin while speaking Konkani and not go too far astray. Grammar was, however, only a first step, as persuasion, not just communication, was the Jesuits' ultimate aim. To this end, missionaries collaborated with local converts to collect and copy out Indian classical texts. In this case, the epic poems, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, including the lines from the 6th book, or Bhishma Parva, that you can see on the screen. These the missionaries read, annotated, and mined for idiomatic expressions and other rhetorical snippets, as well as details relating to Indian philosophy and mythology, such as the shifting gender of the mythological warrior Shikandi, which, as you see on the screen, caught their attention. And it's described in that, it's a marginal note. They then collected all this information in humanist notebooks called commonplace books, which they used when composing sermons and other missionary texts. Within this Indo-humanist context, what then would the native inhabitants of Benaulin, a predominantly Brahmin village in Goa, have made of Almeida's sermon? Although Socrates, Seneca, and Caesar were most likely unfamiliar names to them, the reality is that they probably understood them as participants in long-standing Indian traditions. This was due in large part to Almeida's subtle Jesuit approach to translation. For instance, he glossed Greco-Roman philosophers as Shastra Pravinu, meaning individuals learned in the Shastra, or which is law in the general sense, or more specifically, didactic, religious, and scientific texts in Sanskrit. Transplanted into this world, these Greco-Roman gurus became somewhat eccentric members of an authoritative South Asian philosophical tradition that stood at the heart of Brahmin identity. This sense of partial recognition probably also extended to the philosophical ideas presented in the sermon. In rendering the neo-Stoic idea of constancy that he attributes to Seneca's Socrates as sattva diru, Almeida was grafting it onto the most Brahmin of the 3 gunas, or principles of the universe, known in Sanskrit as sattva, meaning variously balance, harmony, or purity. By making Socrates a champion of sattva, Almeida thus made this ancient Mediterranean philosophical concept recognizable and palatable to his audience of recently converted South Asians, who may have also associated Socrates with Parashurama, the axe-wielding 6th avatar of Vishnu, and another champion of sattva and the Brahmin cause, pictured here, on the site of whose temple Almeida's Church of John the Baptist actually stood. In other words, the appeal of such displays of Indo-humanist learning was due to the fact that the upper caste populations of Portuguese India actively sought to remain Brahmin while becoming Christian. That is to say, they sought to retain their caste status, which was closely associated with spiritual leadership and higher learning in this new cultural context. In the absence of canonical Sanskrit texts, arguments that invoked learned gurus like Socrates probably had significant appeal for this particular native group that we know flocked to Jesuit schools and joined the priesthood by the thousands in the 17th century. Almeida's Indo-humanist approach was thus as much a function of his audience's desire to retain an identity defined by access to learning, as it was of the Portuguese Jesuits' evangelization mission and classical education. To use the language of Native American history or ethnohistory then, Almeida's classicizing sermons point to native agency or the negotiated nature of the evangelization process, and to the formative role of non-European languages, peoples, and social concepts in the history of the classical tradition. Of course, having been brought into this Indo-humanist culture, some Brahmin priests then began to use it to push back against the Jesuits, who purposely blocked their advancement. For instance, Antonio João de Frias did this in his extensive and learned history of the Brahmins, written in Portuguese and published in Lisbon in the early 18th century. After defining nobility in terms of both lineage and virtue, Frias recounted the history of the Goan Brahmins, from their supposed origins in the Chera Empire of ancient southern India to the arrival of Christianity. Significantly for Frias, this took place not with the advent of European colonialism, but with the return to India of Caspar, an emperor of Chera, and of course, one of the biblical magi. All of these arguments he justified with reference to a vast number of ancient Christian and contemporary authors, a scholarly process which, as you'll see in the last item of the handout, he conceived of in terms reminiscent of the opening of Book 2 of Cicero's De Inventione. He says, Zeuxis, who was an ancient Roman painter, intended to give the world a portrait of the beautiful and famous Helen. And so that the drawing would be as charming as possible and do justice to her fame, he combined in a single image the most perfect features of various beautiful women, so that with the vibrancy of his colors and the subtlety of his brush, the perfection of the artwork resembled the perfection given to Helen by nature. In the same way, I shall base this account of the nobility of the Brahmins on the most reliable sources, copied and excerpted from the writings of various authors, whom I consider my teachers, and the whole world holds in high esteem. Indeed, in his text, which is interestingly gendered as feminine, the author cites, among others, Aristotle, Plato, Tacitus, Cassiodorus, Plutarch, Suetonius, Cicero, and Quintilian. At the same time, he also lent heavily on Indian sources, although he purposefully omitted the names of particular Indian authors and texts, lest his Christian readers take offense at the sight of so many pagan authors. He did note, however, that referring in general terms to non-Christian histories and mythologies was not in and of itself problematic. For instance, the myth that the Brahmins were descendants of the creator god Brahma was no different from the Roman idea that Augustus was a descendant of Aeneas, the son of Venus. Such arguments about the commensurability or comparability of the antiquities of South Asia and the Mediterranean in turn served his larger claim that Europeans had no right to dominate the church in India. Rather, it was the Brahmins, the native nobility and priests of India, who should lead a parallel but semi-independent Indian church, free from institutional racism, we would say today, but not necessarily classism. In this way, Friesz pushed back against the Casta system, which relegated even the most educated Indians to relatively minor roles, while remaining committed to his identity as a Brahmin. So to conclude then, what we learn from these three episodes is, I think, that the classical tradition and the agency it gave a diverse array of actors across the global Hispanic world was deeply entangled with constructions of race, gender, and class. These episodes thus suggest, I think, that classical reception studies can benefit in a very profound way from modern post-colonial and intersectional approaches, more commonly found in other disciplines. And that by bringing classics into conversation with these disciplines, a more situated, a more complex, although not always a rosier vision of the classical tradition remains. To put it another way, as we study the past, in part at least, to build a better future in increasingly diverse nations and an ever-globalizing world, such approaches allow us to see not only the dark recesses and the glimmers of light, but also the multiple shades of gray, the multiple intersecting identities, and the multiple forms of agency that combine to form the long shadow of Greece and Rome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I just want to, I'm sure people have questions, and we definitely have time for that. Lots of people are applauding you electronically. Because we had that little mishap with the audio, I turned off people's ability to mute themselves. So I'm going to give that back. And right, so now you are welcome to unmute yourself and show your face if you want also via the camera and ask a question. Or if you prefer, you can just put it in the chat and we'll deal with questions that way. Daniel Nazatnowitz is looking forward to your book, Stuart.
Oh, thank you.
Questions? If you stand on ceremony, you can also raise your hand via Zoom, and I will call on you. I'll ask a question first, Stuart, which is a softball, which we'll give other people time to think. But I'm also genuinely interested in it, and the question is biographical for you. I hope you don't mind. I'm just curious, how did you end up getting interested in this aspect of the classics? What was your sort of journey towards exploring the reception of classics in non-European lands?
Yes, so that's a great question. So I guess I started graduate school with the idea that I would write a history of Latin oratory in the Renaissance, of which there still isn't a good history, actually. I mean, it was something that happened all the time in all sorts of contexts, but we don't actually know much about it. And there are all these orations in print and manuscript that no one's really ever read. And I had that intention, but when I was actually in Milwaukee studying with Reggie, we were sort of bored one afternoon, and I decided that I'd read some of the work of Andrew Laird, who's now at Brown, who writes about Mexico. And I thought, oh, this is something I don't know about. It sounds interesting, and maybe it's my sort of personality. But when I find something I don't know about, I sort of become obsessed with it. And it sort of all started from there. So the next summer, once I had my sort of Latin was up to speed, having studied with Reggie, I went to Mexico City and worked in the archives, and then something sort of piqued my curiosity, and I said, oh, maybe there's something in Peru. So I went to Peru, and then if you go to Peru, you have to go to Chile. Because of the saltpeter war in the 19th century. So a lot of books and manuscripts from Peru were taken to Chile. And then I thought, oh, well, there are these things from the Philippines in Mexico. Maybe I should go there. And it sort of became this sort of crazy 13 countries sort of trek around the world looking for Latin manuscripts, which I obviously didn't have in mind at the beginning, but one thing sort of organically led to the other.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Okay, I see Lizzie Clark has a question.
Hi, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. Your anthology was very impressive here. But I wanted to ask about some light kind of on like what is a good way to understand the way that Iberian colonizers viewed themselves in like reference to the Roman Empire, either as like a new vehicle of that or a new like more like Christianized version of an ancient pagan like empire, and how they use modes of imperialism and adopted those from Rome, and also if there was like ever kind of an argument made for comparing like modern or at the time like contemporary Iberian people to their like pre-Roman ancestors before the Romans conquered what is now the Iberian Peninsula.
Great, thank you, Lizzie. That's a great question. I'll sort of answer the second one first, and then I'll go back to the first part of your question. So you find in early modern Spain an interest in various sort of non-Roman ancient peoples, the Visigoths and things like that, and in Hebrew antiquity, and to some extent in what we might call Muslim antiquity as well. But in the kind of in the larger Iberian world, in the Americas, that tends to fall away slightly. It tends to become slightly more Greco-Roman because of the standard educational program that the Jesuits roll out, right? They're the ones that kind of globalize classical education. There's a standard model. And that's kind of more standard model tends to be the one you end up with outside of Europe. In terms of what sort of antiquity it was, I think, you know, if you come to classics from the sort of modern perspective, it seems a little odd, right? It seems a little mixed. It's a sort of Christian antiquity. It kind of borrows kind of eclectically from across the classical tradition. So I think the best way to think about it is to think of the classical tradition as having a core, let's put it arbitrarily, in the 4th century CE, right? This is kind of the reception of late antiquity, right? Sort of the age of Constantine onwards, which was Roman, right? Which was, you know, kind of, you know, they had Latin public speaking, they had a lot of the institutions, but it was also Christian. and those institutions were, took place within a monarchy, and that monarchy, over time increasingly saw itself as a kind of defender of the faith. So that's kind of the core. We should kind of think about it from the perspective of Ambrose and Augustine, say. That's the classical tradition, and maybe people in the 19th century called that late. I mean, maybe that wasn't the core of the classical tradition for them, but for the people in the 16th century, that sort of was their, that was really an important point of reference. They're reading Cicero, but they're also reading, the orations of Ambrose as well. And as for sort of how Iberians used this as they were expanding across the world, I mean, they did frequently compare, they were an expanding state, and Rome was the archetypal expanding state, with sort of Alexander being useful if you're going to India, as an example. That was, yes, I mean, they did very much see themselves in that mode. But I mean, we should also be sort of alive to the complexities of these societies. Europeans begin to arrive in the early 16th century. In that period of 200 years, you end up with a highly, let's say, westernized indigenous elite. You end up with large populations of people of mixed descent. So to make that really straightforward distinction between sort of colonizers and colonized, which is a kind of 20th century post-colonial nationalist kind of distinction, you really have to dig into the detail and the biographies of individual people and see what their interests and motivations were when you're looking, at, say, their interest in the classical tradition. Because when you dig down to the level of detail, it always ends up being more complicated than the kind of quote-unquote textbook version.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We've got another question from the chat. This is from Debbie, who asks, how's Latin and Roman culture / civilization received in Hong Kong or at the institution where you're at right now? Any interesting perspectives to share?
Okay. Yes, so the Chinese University of Hong Kong was founded in 1963, and its core was an earlier institution called New Asia College, which was founded by refugee Confucians fleeing communism in 1949, and their idea was to preserve Confucian culture, which obviously didn't do terribly well in the second half of the 20th century in China, and to what they called act as a bridge between the East and the West. So to create a sort of educational program that was rooted in the Chinese classics, but also looked out to other major classical traditions. And the main point of reference there it was Western Europe and North America in that sort of context of the 1950s. So that is in many ways still the curriculum today. I'm on the it's now called, in history it's called Chinese history and world history, and that's sort of what I'm responsible for on the teaching side, and I have to say it's a very sort of liberating and exciting experience to be responsible for. I have a colleague who's a Byzantinist and a Hellenist, and he does the Greek side, and I do the Latin side, and I do everything from from ancient Rome to the Renaissance, basically. And it's really, it forces you to think both in kind of larger, to look at things with a wider lens, but also to think about things comparatively as well. I mean, what is unique or not in fact about what we might call the Western tradition? It's really it's tremendously eye-opening, I have to say, and that's all. I'm still a little bit kind of bowled over by the whole experience. As my literary Chinese slowly develops, it's becoming even more exciting. So.
Fantastic. Someone's noted in the comments too, the Itati Renaissance Library collection, the Battle of Lepanto, which has Juan Latino's text. So thank you for that, Michael. Are there any other questions for Stuart? If not, I don't see any hands. Well, if not, well, thank you. This was wonderful, so interesting and rich, and I'm envious of your travels and all your learning.
I'm envious of my previous self.
Sounds wonderful. I'll just remind the audience that this talk has been recorded and it'll be posted on Paideia Institute's YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up on any of it or watch certain parts over again, you can do that. I'll close by thanking our speaker again, Stuart. It was brilliant. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you all hopefully at the next online talk. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah.
Bye-bye.